If it's Wednesday, President Biden is set to address the nation and his historic decision to drop out of the race as Vice President Kamala Harris hits the trail and sharpens her attacks against former President Trump. Plus, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addresses a joint session of Congress vowing to win the war against Hamas and bring the remaining hostages home as pro-Palestinian and anti-Netanyahu protesters rally all around the Capitol. And FBI Director Christopher Wray testifies before Congress, revealing chilling new details about the Trump assassination attempt, including how the shooters studied the rally site and searched online, quote, how far away was Oswald from Kennedy? Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Kristen Welker. With just days until the opening ceremony for the Olympics in Paris, a different kind of torch passing is underway here in Washington. In just a few hours from now, in prime time, President Biden will address the nation for the first time about his decision to withdraw from the race and endorse Vice President Kamala Harris. Ahead of his remarks, the White House this afternoon previewing what Americans can expect to hear.
Tonight, the president will discuss his historic decision to put the country above all else and about the inflection point we face as a country in this moment. This is one of those rare moments in history when the decisions we make now will determine the future of our nation.
Meanwhile, the Democratic Party's de facto nominee was back on the road after her first campaign rally yesterday for a keynote speech to an historically black sorority focused on social justice. It comes as the Harris campaign has for the very first time outlined what it sees as its path to victory in a new memo focused on a coalition of black voters, women voters, and young voters. At the event this afternoon, Harris outlining her vision for the future.
In this moment, I believe we face a choice between two different visions for our nation. One focused on the future, the other focused on the past. And with your support, I am fighting for our nation's future. These extremists want to take us back, but we are not going back. We are not going back.
It comes as today the DNC Rules Committee met to formalize the nomination process with less than a month until its convention kicking off and just 2 weeks until a virtual roll call of delegates. The compressed timeline means Harris might have mere days to vet and pick a running mate, as NBC News is tracking at least 9 potential contenders in the mix. Meanwhile, former President Trump is set to hold his first rally since President Biden's withdrawal from the race, as Republicans look to sharpen their attacks against Harris, in part by tying her to President Biden, as the former president did in an interview last night.
She was the worst vice president, and he was the worst president. By the way, he was the worst president we've ever had, and her ratings are lower than his ratings, so I don't know how she can do well, but maybe she can. It's a crazy world out there.
It comes as Republican leadership is reportedly warning against attacking Harris's race and gender after a few House Republicans called her a, quote, DEI hire and DEI vice president. House Speaker Mike Johnson's message to his conference: this should not be about personalities. It should be about policy. And we have a record to compare. This has nothing to do with race. Pretty stern words there from the House Speaker. I want to bring in our team of NBC News reporters. Mike Memoli is covering President Biden, as he has been for years. Yamiche Alcindor is in Indianapolis covering Vice President Harris. Alex Seitzwald is following the latest rules deliberations inside the DNC. And Vaughn Hilliard is in Charlotte, North Carolina, ahead of former President Trump's rally tonight. Mike Memoli, I have to go to you to kick things off. Set the scene inside the White House. What are sources close to the president saying about tonight? Of course, the last time a sitting president announced he was dropping out of the race, it was Lyndon Johnson with a 40-minute address.
Yeah, that's right, Kristen. This was a deeply personal decision that the president made, and this is going to be a very personal address. The president has not been seen, only in brief glimpses. We only heard a little bit of him during that visit by the vice president to her campaign headquarters. But the president really did want the first time he would speak extensively in public to be this personal address to the American people, where he will explain that decision that he made. He'll also talk about what he wants to be the work of his administration for the remaining 6 months of his time in office, building on what he's been able to do over the last 3.5 years. We heard, and I just came out of the press briefing with Karine Jean-Pierre, her talk about this idea of an inflection point moment. That does speak to the fact that this will be in some ways a political speech. He will lay out the choice that voters will be facing in this election in a more high-level way. But ultimately, as I'm talking to people in the West Wing, people close to the president at this moment, they do see this as the beginning of a new campaign of sorts, as the beginning of a campaign to shape his legacy, understanding that in so many ways his legacy will be determined in large part based on whether the vice president is successful in succeeding him or if Donald Trump is the one returning to the White House.
It's such an important point, Mike, and obviously that is key to why he made this decision. It'll be interesting to see how much detail he gives us about how he came to this final, what must have been incredibly difficult decision. It's a fascinating moment because it's a moment for Vice President Harris to rebrand herself. And in some ways, it's a moment for President Biden to rebrand and in a way write the first draft of how he wants to be remembered, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a president who has been through a moment similar to this before. In 2015, of course, he announced that he would not run for president in 2016. And when he did so, he said just because he's not a candidate does not mean he will be silent, that he intended to remain engaged in the public debate. One of the big questions is just how much will he be involved in the campaign going forward. He certainly wants to be out there to help the vice president in her election. But in some ways, these are decisions that are now up to the vice president and to her team of advisors to determine. But the president clearly does view one of the most important decisions he made was selecting Vice President Kamala Harris to serve with him in the administration. And so as we were just speaking with Karine Jean-Pierre, one of the questions is, does she have now an enhanced role within the administration? Does she have a bigger seat at the table? Does she have more of a say over what the administration does going forward? Karine Jean-Pierre saying they've always been close partners and speaking extensively with one another, and that will continue at this point. Yeah, undoubtedly it will. And just set the scene there, Mike. We know that staffers were invited to watch this speech. This has to be a time of incredible emotions there for all of the people who are close to President Biden, given that he has made what was a really difficult decision. Yeah, that's right. So many of the White House officials I've been speaking to have been talking about feeling the range of emotions over the course of these last few days. Some of them shock, of course, at only hearing about the decision the same way all of us did by seeing that post on social media. Some of them feeling anger, including at those who they feel in the Democratic Party forced the president to have to make this decision, but also very deep sadness about the end of this 54-year career in elected office. And at this point, though, as one put it to me, there's no real time for sentimentality. They have to keep getting work done. They want to run through the tape, as Karine Jean-Pierre said in the briefing. They have so much work to do to support the vice president. And so at this point, they do feel in some ways a sense of renewal and new energy to see through that task as well. Mike Memoli, as the Biden whisperer, there is no better person to start off our coverage today. Mike, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Yamiche, let me turn to you. You were at Vice President Harris's event today. She spoke to Zeta Phi Beta. Of course, she's a member of another sorority, Alpha Kappa Alpha. Talk a little bit about the significance. What did you hear from the Vice President today, Yamiche?
Well, it was very significant that Vice President Kamala Harris, on day 3 of her campaign, came to Zeta Phi Beta's boule here, a gathering of Black women who are going to really be really critical to her winning in November, because these are the people that she's going to want to rise and knock on doors and make calls. And as you said, this is a group that's part of the Divine Nine. It's a group of historically black fraternities and sororities. She is a member, of course, of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. And these groups were founded more than 100 years ago, and they really are focused on civil rights. A lot of their leaders, including people like Martin Luther King, was from Alpha Phi Alpha, as well as Rosa Parks, who was an honorary member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, that they were focused on civil rights in this way. So in her speech, she was talking a lot about this being sort of a people-centered campaign in her mind, telling them that at one point, if we mobilize, we can change the nation. If we mobilize, we can move mountains. And there was really raucous cheers here, applause. It felt in some ways like a homecoming, because we should say throughout her time in public office, she has embraced members of the Divine Nine. She's brought them multiple times to the White House. She's held calls. She's really been in touch with these sororities and fraternities. So really, a lot of people here felt like this was someone that they knew and that they now are really energized to fight for her.
And it's really a clear sign that she is trying to energize this part of her constituency. And as that memo laid out today, she will be targeting not only voters of color, but obviously young voters as well, and as a range of different other parts of the Biden coalition. Let me ask you, moving forward, about what you are anticipating, the strategy. Where do you anticipate she's going to be focused in the coming days?
Well, that's really important, because now she has to really make up for lost time. And I've been hearing for weeks, as they were sort of quietly getting ready for the fact that she might be the top of the ticket. Of course, that moment is here now. She's going to really be focused on mobilizing African-American voters in the South. I'm told Georgia, North Carolina being key, Pennsylvania being another place. Think about Philadelphia being another place that's really important in her mind. But without also giving out and without also forgetting about the sort of West and thinking about Nevada and Arizona. My sense is that she's going to be hitting the road even more than she already was. She was a vice president that was on the road a lot, but now that she's a candidate, she's really going to be trying to introduce herself to some voters who maybe know of her as vice president but don't know her background. Just yesterday, when we were in Wisconsin, I learned that she lived in Wisconsin when she was a little girl, when her mother was a cancer researcher. And I've covered her for a while, but the idea that she's branded herself and people know her as someone from California, that they're really going to be trying to really roll out more of her bio. I also was told that they want to highlight very sort of easygoing things, including the fact that she loves to cook. So talking about sort of food scenes. So she's really going to try to be making herself relatable. I know we'll probably talk about beef steaks, so I'll leave sort of that conversation. But the idea is that for her, as the top of the ticket, she's really going to be focused on sort of crisscrossing and barnstorming the country here.
Yeah, we are going to talk beef steaks in just a minute. You're absolutely right, Yamiche. But that rebranding effort that is underway, as you say, is going to be clearly a critical part of her strategy moving forward. Yamiche, thanks so much. Alex Seitzwald, let me turn to you now. Democrats rallying around Harris, and it happened very swiftly in a very robust way. She's not officially the nominee yet. You've been tracking the DNC Rules Committee meeting today. What does the process look like? Do we know anything more about the timeline for this?
Yeah, Kristen, the process to make her the official nominee is going to look very different from the roll call votes that we have seen and know and possibly love from past conventions, where you go around all the states. It's kind of raucous. Instead, Democrats are going to do something very unusual. They're going to do a virtual roll call vote ahead of the convention. And that's actually been the plan for months, to get around a potential legal issue in Ohio. The deadline to get on the ballot there is August 7th. The legislature changed it, but they're not sure if it goes into effect. So that had been the plan all along. It was kind of a inconsequential detail when it was Joe Biden running. But then now with Harris running and the potential for other candidates, they revisited that. They decided to stick with it. And just moments ago, the Rules Committee passed it. So they're trying to get her nomination officially wrapped up by August 7th ahead of that. And then at the convention, it will be a kind of ceremonial crowning for her.
So, Alex, let me ask you, and this is significant what you're saying. You're saying they've now agreed that August 7th date is a go. So they're going to move forward with that. Is there any room for a potential challenger at this point, Alex?
Yeah, good question. There is, but not much. If you want to run against Kamala Harris for the Democratic presidential nomination, you have just days to act. You have until Saturday to announce your candidacy, and you only have until Tuesday to get what they call threshold support. That's where you need to get 300 signatures from delegates to the convention. So you better move very fast. and the vote on the nomination is going to happen as soon as August 1st. So this is compressing everything in this timeline. You know, critics might say to try to squeeze out anyone who might run against her, but it's also clear that she has really consolidated party support. According to our tally, she has something like 3/4 of all delegates to the convention already supporting her. So I think the biggest impact will be on her vice presidential search, compressing all of that potentially to just 2 weeks to try to get ahead of that August 7th deadline.
So she'll have to have it in by August 7th.
A little bit unclear. As far as the Democratic Party is concerned, they are delivering the presidential nominee. They say it's up to the campaign and up to the candidate herself whether she wants to get her vice presidential nominee ahead of that August 7th deadline. It's clear they think that that would be safer to avoid potential litigation, but they have written the rules in a way that give her up until the convention, which is only August 19th. So, you know, it's not an enormous amount of time. But it's clear that from what we've heard from sources in the Harris campaign and the DNC, they really want to get both nominations by August 7th. So this is going to move very, very quickly.
All right. Well, appreciate your keeping us updated on all of these fascinating and fast-moving developments today. Alex, thank you so much. Vaughn, let me head over to you. You're in Charlotte, where we're going to hear from Donald Trump for the first time since he got a new opponent. I mean, it's just stunning to think about how much has changed in the course of a few days here. What are you going to be watching for, Vaughn?
Right, I was actually at Donald Trump's last rally on Saturday night in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and was talking to RNC Chairman Michael Whatley at that event, and there was foreshadowing. What if they do swap out Joe Biden at the top of the ticket? How does that change the game for you? Well, I just saw him here again, and of course, Saturday night, a few hours later, we came Sunday afternoon, and there is a new candidate who is going to be going mano a mano with Donald Trump at the top of the ticket. When I asked him about how Kamala Harris changes the dynamics of the race, he says he doesn't believe it does. He made the case that they are expecting that there is going to be what he described a sugar high bump in the polls for Kamala Harris and the Democratic ticket here in the days and weeks ahead, but their effort is going to be to directly tie her to everything that the Biden administration stood for and ultimately the consequences of its border policies, and make it clear that it was always the Biden-Harris campaign. There's just one name that's no longer a part of the campaign, but that is still Kamala Harris, and she takes full responsibility for everything that they were already planning to run against Joe Biden on for the last 3.5 years of the Democratic administration.
Let me ask you a little bit about Veep stakes, Vaughn, from this perspective. When you and I were covering the RNC, part of what we were reporting on is Trump's pick of J.D. Vance. And the big takeaway is, boy, he made that decision from a position of strength. It was not necessarily someone who will help him with the electoral map. He could in certain places, but he's not going to necessarily change or overhaul the map. Now we have a Kamala Harris, her vice presidential nominee, yet to be named, but there's some real opportunity there. She's looking at the potential governor of Pennsylvania, obviously Senator Mark Kelly. I mean, she's looking at a number of these key battleground state governors or senators, and that could change the shape of this race, Vaughn. Is there concern inside the Trump administration about that?
Right now, the way that, again, Michael Whatley, the RNC chairman, referenced to me, he goes, there's 7 to 9 battleground states. And just take North Carolina, where actually he was the chair of the Republican Party here in North Carolina. And if you were to pick Roy Cooper, the North Carolina governor, to be Kamala Harris's running mate, he goes, it could be a point or two, but they still feel confident about their ability to not only hold the state, but believe that it would have minimum impact around the country. Yet, when you're looking at somebody like a Mark Kelly out of Arizona, I would make the case that suddenly that is part of the extended parameters of what it would take to clinch the nomination for Kamala Harris. Of course, if you're Democrats, you believe the likes of Pennsylvania is perhaps your best pickup opportunity. But if you can add Arizona to the mix, suddenly you're getting closer to 270. And one other thing I'll throw out there, in 2022, he actually beat Blake Masters in a Senate race by 4.5 percentage points. And you could say J.D. Vance was the political brother of Blake Masters back in Arizona in those 2022 Senate races. They were both the ones that received big dollar donations from Peter Thiel, sort of that techie, sort of new right form, and he effectively was able to beat him pretty decisively. So that could make Mark Kelly rather appealing for this Democratic ticket.
Well, we await this decision with great anticipation. Everything just got shaken up and very interesting. And Vaughn Hilliard, thank you so much for kicking us off today. We really appreciate it. Coming up, we are going to have more of the Harris campaign's search for a running mate just ahead. Who will it be? When will we know? And what will it mean for the trajectory of this race? The panel's next. But first, an important programming note. We'll have live special coverage of President Biden's Oval Office address tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern right here on NBC News Now. Do not miss it and stay with us. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Turning now to the very latest in Vice President Harris's urgent search for a running mate as the clock ticks down to the Democratic convention next month and a virtual roll call of delegates before that. Joining me now on set is our panel, Washington Post congressional reporter Mariana Sotomayor, former Maryland Democratic Congresswoman Donna Edwards. She is also an NBC News political analyst, and Republican strategist Brad Todd, who we should note is advising the David McCormick campaign in Pennsylvania, which we will talk about a little bit later on in this conversation. But we have to start with Veep stakes. Mariana, let me read to you what Chuck Todd wrote in his latest column about her search for a vice presidential nominee. This is an opportunity for Americans to get a glimpse at the type of Democrats she wants to run the country. This isn't just about picking a running mate. This is about setting a tone for the type of politics she intends to practice. Harris can tease out all of these things through a strategic use of the Veep stakes process. Chuck goes on to talk about the fact that she should hold meetings with people like Liz Cheney, with people in the business sector. What is your sense of how she's going to conduct this search?
Yeah, I mean, she absolutely should be going out there. I think it's so important. And Chuck makes this point very well, that in 2019, when she was running in her own primary, it was kind of hard to understand who she was, right? Yeah. You would ask her about any issue and she would be very dodgy. She was weighing, do I appeal to the liberal base? Do I try to appeal to more centrists, right? So this is not just a moment for her to try and find a VP who could potentially set the tone for 2028, future Democratic, or the Democratic Party in future elections. But I also think it's a moment for her to define herself. And it's something that we're all really going to be finding out, because there's been many points in her career where she has tried to shy away, for example, when she was AG and a prosecutor. Now she's fully embracing that. So that's something I'm watching for her is she going to be her authentic self? And does that appeal to voters? And who's going to balance that a little bit in her VP pick?
It is going to be fascinating. Donna, this is the most consequential decision she will make to date. What are you watching for, and who do you think she's going to pick, if you had to venture a guess?
Well, look, first of all, I think it is a consequential decision, but it's also one that she participated in, and she knows that. And she did that with President Biden, and she saw from him how consequential, in fact, it is. And okay, here's where my money is. My money is on Tim Walz, governor, two-term governor, successful governor of Minnesota. Former member of Congress, decorated Afghanistan veteran, brings a lot to the table. Roy Cooper, North Carolina, two-term governor again. So you're not going to run the risk of having a governor's seat open. And she served with Roy Cooper as an AG, so she really knows him and he knows her, and they like each other.
And having that personal relationship can be so critical. Brad, who do you think Republicans are most concerned about? Who would be the biggest threat, do you think, to the Trump campaign?
Well, I think one way to look at that is to look at how she got picked as vice president. Joe Biden needed someone who was far to the left of him because he was perceived as far to the right. So that tells you that her challenge is the reverse. She's so far left, she's going to have to pick someone to her right. But she's a pretty conventional and cautious Democratic politician. So I don't think she's going to do anything outside the box. I think Chuck's piece was very smart. I don't think she'll do any of it. I think she's going to pick people who are conventional Democrats who are to right of her, but it's not hard to be right of her.
Well, that could be Mark Kelly. I mean, you're describing a Mark Kelly.
I think it could be. He's a senator. She knows him. He's been pre-vetted. He'll be deemed acceptable quickly by the political class, and she is very much a political insider who will want approval from the political class.
Yeah. Let's take a look at how Republicans are starting to go after the vice president. This is an ad by the David McCormick campaign. Let's take a look.
Kamala Harris is inspiring and very capable. The more people get to know her, they're going to be particularly impressed by her ability.
I am prepared to get rid of the filibuster to pass a Green New Deal. There's no question I'm in favor of banning fracking.
Would you ban offshore drilling?
Yes.
Abolish ICE?
Yeah.
Is that a position you agree with?
And we need to probably think about starting from scratch. Outdated, it is wrong-headed thinking to think that the only way you're going to get communities to be safe is to put more police officers on the street.
Brad, talk a little bit about this strategy.
Well, I think this whole race comes down to Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Arguably, Pennsylvania is the most important state. I've heard both people on both sides say it's a one-state strategy. She's uniquely poorly situated to win Pennsylvania. She's already said she'd come out and ban fracking. That's 330,000 jobs in Pennsylvania, direct and indirect. That's a big deal. She said she wants to do mandatory buybacks on guns. That's a big deal in a state where one of the highest rates of concealed carry permits. The other thing I think is a sleeper and a way for Republicans to get some Democrat votes is a lot of unions really negotiated hard for health care benefits. She said she'd eliminate private health care insurance. That's a big deal to people who are in unions, people whose parents were in unions. So anyway, I think we'll see Bob Casey and other Democrats have to wear her record.
Donna, how should she counter those inevitable attacks that have already started coming her way, and how concerned are Democrats about that?
Well, I think one of the great things that she has going for her, and she knows that, is that she actually has an agenda with President Biden that she can run on, where they didn't ban fracking but got a major piece of climate legislation through, where they try to get something, first kind of gun safety that they've had in decades under her and Joe Biden's administration. So I think she actually has the ability right now for a lot of Americans who really don't know her to define herself. And she started that in the first couple of speeches that we heard. And I think that you're going to hear more of her defining her bio so it doesn't get defined for her.
Yeah, she's running as the prosecutor against the felon. Let me play a little bit of what Democrats have been saying about Harris.
I was a courtroom prosecutor. In those roles, I took on perpetrators of all kinds. Predators who abused women, fraudsters who ripped off consumers, cheaters who broke the rules for their own gain. So hear me when I say, I know Donald Trump's type.
Mariana, clearly that is going to be her line of attack. It's clear, it's crisp, and it's very direct.
Yeah, and it's absolutely welcomed by Democrats. I mean, I've talked to so many on Capitol Hill, including those frontliner types who are always a little skittish about the top of the ticket. And they're like, yes, talk about how you were a prosecutor. Because Democrats for some time, for several years now, have been trying to push back against the Republican attacks on public safety, crime, obviously, this year. They think that having her talk about that will help them on the campaign trail. We'll see, because of course she's going to get attacked all the time, Republicans, on her public safety record and things that she did in the past when she was an attorney general. But it's something that Democrats are very much welcoming.
It's telling that she's trying to talk about something 20 years ago, though, instead of the last 4 years when she was in the vice president's office or when she ran for president. That's going to be a big disconnect. Republicans are going to drive it home.
Except that she connects it to her opponent, Donald Trump. And so she uses her history to connect it to what she views as a lawless former president of the United States.
And speaking of the president of the United States, a big moment for President Biden tonight. Donna, what are you going to be looking for when he addresses the nation?
Well, I think it's going to allow him an opportunity to continue to celebrate his agenda over the last 3.5 years. It's going to allow him to offer a bridge to the future that Democrats have wanted and that they now have with Kamala Harris. And I think the American people are actually looking forward to it because it allows him to make a graceful, almost exit from the stage.
Brad, what do you think?
I'm going to find it really ironic that a lot of Democrats are going to praise him and cheer him tonight, the same people who were trying to run him out of the job last week. And politics is a pretty brutal business. And so I don't think it's going to be a very eventful night for him. I think the big moment for Joe Biden was Sunday.
Well, and it was. I mean, he sort of, even though we were anticipating it, I think a lot of people were stunned when they saw it in black and white that here he had decided to actually drop out of the race. I think, Mariana, it will be fascinating to see how much he gives us a window into how he came to this decision.
That's exactly what I'm watching for. I mean, during the campaign trail in 2020, when I covered him, he would talk about being that bridge. Now he's in that moment where he is giving that moment up. And, you know, just talking to Democrats who literally have gotten emotional thinking about these last couple of days, supporters of him, they're very fearful that he could really internalize this and take it negatively and, like, have resentments in the future and moving forward with the party. And this will be a window, to your point, Kristen, of, you know, is he going to be that empathetic character, not just to people like we have known him to be with voters, but is he going to have some empathy for himself? And I think that'll be very telling tonight.
Well, I think for people who've known Joe Biden, though, I think the expectation is that, in fact, he is going to be that empathetic leader.
Well, we'll be watching. Thank you all. Really appreciate it. Great conversation, Mariana, Donna, and Brad. Coming up next, wartime divisions and an historic address. Israel's prime minister rallies Congress as he faces protests from both inside and outside the Capitol. Do stay with us. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu delivered remarks before a joint session of Congress today as he continues to forge ahead with Israel's military campaign in Gaza. This was the scene as Netanyahu arrived at the Capitol building with thousands of protesters chanting for the U.S. to stop arming Israel and others carrying signs calling the prime minister a war criminal and accusing him of genocide. More than 36 lawmakers, mostly Democrats, but including at least one Republican, boycotted Netanyahu's speech over his handling of the war. And one Democrat inside the chamber held up a sign calling Netanyahu a war criminal. In his remarks, the prime minister was defiant, saying that protesters who are standing with Hamas should be ashamed of themselves and blasting the International Criminal Court for trying to, quote, shackle Israel's hands. He also acknowledged the hostage families in attendance.
The pain these families have endured is beyond words. I met with them again yesterday, and I promised them this: I will not rest until all their loved ones are home, all of them. As we speak, we're actively engaged in intensive efforts to secure their release, and I'm confident that these efforts can succeed. Some of them are taking place right now.
And joining me now is Gary Grumbach, who has been monitoring the protests here in D.C. So, Gary, I know things are getting a little intense. Set the scene for us. What's happening as we are speaking right now?
We have spent the afternoon at several different protests. Some were pro-Israel, some were pro-Palestine. All of them were looking to bring the hostages home. Many of them, all of them really, were anti-Benjamin Netanyahu. This is what's left here outside of Union Station after a pro-Palestinian protest took place here. There were thousands and thousands of people on the grounds, and this is some of what the graffiti looks like. Free Gaza, some expletives here written on the statues in front of Union Station. And as we speak, there is still a skirmish happening on the other side. I'm going to ask Tony to step up on the ledge here so he can take a look at what's going on. A skirmish between U.S. Capitol Police, MPD, and several pro-Palestinian protesters. As you can see, some of those officers are on the move right now. We are certainly a safe distance away from them. But the security around the Capitol has been very intense today. You cannot get into the U.S. Capitol building without specific passes. There is bike racks surrounding the entire U.S. Capitol building, and agencies from across the region and federal agencies are here as well, making sure the folks outside and inside the building are staying safe here, Kristen.
It certainly is a dynamic situation there, Gary. Are you expecting protests tomorrow when the Prime Minister meets with President Biden?
So certainly that is expected outside of the White House. This is sort of a much bigger, I think, group and gathering that we're seeing here today. Some of these folks traveled from across the country. I spoke to one person who was on a bus from Florida, came up overnight for this protest specifically. I'm sure if they stick around, they'll be there tomorrow outside the White House as well.
All right, Gary Grumbach, please continue to stay safe. Thank you for that report. We really appreciate it. I now want to bring in Ambassador Dennis Ross, former special envoy to the Mideast and an NBC News foreign affairs analyst. Thank you so much for joining us, Ambassador. Really appreciate it.
Sure. Good to be with you.
I just want to start off by getting your reaction to what we heard from Prime Minister Netanyahu. What were the big takeaways for you?
Look, I think the essence of his speech was about trying to reframe the narrative, to remind everybody that October 7th is very much on the minds of Israelis. I actually often say, for Israelis, it's still October 7th, partly because the hostages are a daily reminder of it, partly because there's been no real explanation for why the IDF was as slow as it was on October 7th to be able to respond to what Hamas did, and partly because there's been no real accountability for what was the worst day in Israel's history, no accountability among the military, no accountability at the political level. And what he was doing was reminding the world and certainly the American public that Hamas did these grotesque things, and he was reminding them of what Israel was dealing with, and that in effect, no one would accept having a neighbor like Hamas next to them and do nothing about it. So I think it was important for him to tell that story. I think he wanted to do one other thing. He wanted to show who the Israeli military is. You saw several soldiers, two of which are soldiers of color, as a way of taking on this notion of Israel being a kind of white colonial state. This is not who Israel is. And he wanted to show that picture very vividly. So I think what you were really seeing was, more than anything else, this was an effort to sort of reshape the narrative on the one hand, and to thank the United States on the other for everything it's done, while reminding us that Israel, in effect, by taking on Hamas, is also taking on Iran, is taking on those who are enemies, not just of Israel, but of the United States as well.
And, of course, we heard his impassioned promise to continue to fight to get the hostages home. And, of course, the families of the hostages are pushing for a ceasefire deal to do exactly that. They are saying, we want a ceasefire deal. We want it now. We want it next week. Can you give us the reality check there, Ambassador? Because there have been so many stops and starts as it relates to these talks. Is it even conceivable that there could be a deal in the near term, in the near future?
It is conceivable. There are two reasons. One reason is that Hamas has made a concession on what has been a condition that they imposed. It was a condition that they wouldn't start this three-phase process unless there was a commitment in advance to a complete ceasefire. Now, they have walked back to where they were in February. In February, they made they expressed the willingness to launch this three-way process and not nail down the idea of a commitment to a permanent ceasefire until the second phase. Each phase is to be 42 days. They walked that back, and then a couple of weeks ago, they now went back to the position they had in February. The other part of this was that Israel made a concession which allowed them to say, okay, there's a linkage between phase one and phase two. Starting on day 16 of phase one, we will begin to negotiate for a permanent ceasefire. Even if we don't reach it, we'll go to the second phase. So that means you'd have almost a guarantee that you'd have at least 84 days of a pause. So I do think we're seeing something that is different than we've seen before, but you're right to be somewhat skeptical as to whether or not we're going to see this. I'd add one last point. I think the key for Prime Minister Netanyahu is there are those within his own coalition who are prepared to bolt if he accepts the deal. But he's under enormous pressure from the hostage families and also the majority within Israel itself, who understand Israel failed those families on October 7th when hostages were taken. They can't fail them a second time by not being able to recover all the hostages alive. The idea that they would get them back but only dead, that would be a second failure.
That is such an important and powerful point. You know, there's a lot of questions, and you and I have talked about this. What happens once this phase of the war ends? What happens the day after Prime Minister Netanyahu says, okay, we now feel as though we have defeated at least the leadership structure of Hamas? Let me play you a little bit of what he had to say about that and get your reaction on the other side.
Sure.
The day after we defeat Hamas, a new Gaza can emerge. My vision for that day is of a demilitarized and de-radicalized Gaza. Israel does not seek to resettle Gaza, but for the foreseeable future, we must retain overriding security control there to prevent the resurgence of terror, to ensure that Gaza never again poses a threat to Israel.
Do you think that that's realistic? Would the U.S., would Arab nations agree to having Israel maintain a security presence there?
I think the answer is no. He used language, though, that was a little bit more artful than that. He talked about Israel retaining overall security control. They don't necessarily have to be in Gaza to maintain overall security control. They can also have an understanding with what may be Arab forces that come in which there would be a set of circumstances in which Israel would only act if there was a threat that was emerging. So there are different ways to get at what he was suggesting without necessarily implying that Israel stays within Gaza. You are not going to get Arab forces, whether it's the UAE, Egypt, Morocco, or others. You're not going to get any kind of international or regional presence in Gaza that would be a security presence so long as Israel remains within Gaza itself. But you can create some artful approaches where there's an understanding if there are threats that these forces can't handle themselves, or if it becomes clear there's emerging threat, it's understood Israel is not going to wait to be hit.
All right, Ambassador Dennis Ross, thank you so much for your time and your perspective today. Really appreciate it.
Happy to be with you. Thank you.
Still to come, the FBI director reveals new details about the timeline of the Trump assassination attempt and the shooter's chilling actions leading up to that day. That new reporting is next. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. New revelations today about the attempted assassination of former President Trump. As right now, FBI Director Christopher Wray continues his testimony before the House Judiciary Committee after telling lawmakers about how the gunman, Thomas Crooks, studied the rally site, prepared for his attack, and accessed a nearby roof.
So in addition, it appears that around 3:50 p.m., 4 o'clock in that window, on the day of the shooting, that the shooter was flying the drone around the area. I would say these are relatively, again, keyword relatively crude devices themselves, but they did have the ability to be detonated remotely. And so to that point, in addition to the two devices that we recovered out of his vehicle, there were receivers for those two explosive devices. Okay. With the devices on July 6th, he did a Google search for, quote, how far away was Oswald from Kennedy? We now believe that the subject climbed onto the roof using some mechanical equipment on the ground and vertical piping on the side of the AGR building. In other words, we do not believe he used a ladder to get up there.
Just stunning revelations there. NBC News law enforcement and intelligence correspondent Tom Winter joins me now. Tom, thanks so much for being here. So in addition to everything that we heard, what were your key takeaways? What's the significance of what we heard from Wray?
Kristen, I think it was a couple of things. So one of the things we've been trying to understand is how he was able to walk around for as long as he did without being detected that he had a weapon. It's one thing to be suspicious at a rally, and as you well know from covering rallies, and it's regardless of the candidate, there are individuals that are there because they want to act out politically, they have something to say, or they might not be entirely with the program. And so those individuals around, and that happens. And so law enforcement has to understand if they're a threat or not, or they're just acting up a little bit, and it's ultimately no big deal. What we didn't understand is for somebody that eventually shot at Trump using an AR-style rifle, according to the FBI, how they were able to move around without somebody detecting he had an AR-style rifle, which is obviously quite long in length. And the key detail today, I think, is that the stock of that was collapsible. What do I mean is that the longer end of that rifle was collapsible or even detachable. That's kind of consistent with newer models of that. It's not kind of something that requires a lot of assembly to put together. And so that may have certainly assisted him in walking around without detection, or at least detection on a level of how serious of a threat he might have been. But it's clear he put a lot of thought into this. It's clear he did some reconnaissance, as you heard the director talk about the use of a drone. And with respect to the bombs, the details on that continue to get worse. He did miss a couple of ingredients, and not to conduct a bomb school class here on Meet the Press Daily will withhold some of those. He was also probably a little bit too far away for the commercial firework device that he'd hoped to use. But certainly somehow this could have even been worse, I think, is the bottom line from the director today, Kristen.
And Tom, we have about 30 seconds left. It's remarkable how much detail we got from Christopher Wray as compared to Kimberly Cheadle, who, of course, resigned her post as Secret Service director. Why the disconnect?
Well, I think first off, the FBI is more of an investigative organization. They're doing the thing that they always do, which is develop a complete timeline from start to finish, what happened and when. It's the critical thing of understanding not only what happened here, what this individual's motivations may have been, but perhaps the extreme frustration with Congress that we saw is that the Secret Service didn't have concrete answers to be able to help them in the future. What actually happened, what was missed, and a timeline, Kristen, helps solve all that.
Well, Tom, you've been all over this from the very beginning that this story broke. We really appreciate your bringing us your reporting today. Thanks so much. Coming up after the break, we are previewing President Biden's historic Oval Office address and what it means for this moment, his legacy, and the history books. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. President Biden is about to deliver remarks for the history books as he speaks from the White House as the first sitting president to withdraw from the presidential race since 1968. That year, in late March, Lyndon Baines Johnson delivered this address to the nation with the Vietnam War raging and tensions high at home.
I have concluded that I should not permit the presidency to become involved in the partisan divisions that are developing in this political year. With our hopes and the world's hopes for peace and the balance every day, I do not believe that I should devote an hour or a day of my time to any personal partisan causes or to any duties other than the awesome duties of this office, the presidency of your country. Accordingly, I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Joining me now to discuss the moment is NBC News presidential historian Michael Beschloss. Thank you so much for joining us, Michael. I really appreciate
pleasure always,
it.
Kristen.
Let's talk about this extraordinary parallel. Here we have President Biden about to deliver an address that we can only imagine will be replayed over and over again in the history books. What are you thinking about as we prepare to hear from the president tonight?
Well, I'm so glad you used that LBJ soundbite from 1968 because it shows how unique tonight is. LBJ pulled out, but two differences from tonight. He did it in March, not in July, right before the Democratic convention. We've never seen anything like what we're going to see tonight. And the other thing is, if I could put a footnote on history, LBJ said he wouldn't run and wouldn't accept the nomination, but I talked to his wife, Lady Bird, who died about nearly 20 years ago, and she told me that LBJ hoped that after pulling out, he could make peace in Vietnam, and secretly he hoped that, despite what he had said about pulling out, the Democratic Convention would draft him in thanks and he might run for another term. Nothing like that tonight.
What a just remarkable revelation that is in and of itself.
I was really surprised.
It's just extraordinary to hear that. What will you be watching for tonight, Michael? What do you think President Biden needs to do and needs to say in this moment?
Well, you know, we know that he's withdrawn. You know, you and I and everyone, all of our friends watching have heard all sorts of explanations of why he stepped aside, but we really don't know yet. So for the first time, we're going to hear what he says. He's going to frame a huge national and international event for all of us in a way that we haven't yet heard.
And of course, 1968 was a time that was so tumultuous. Are there parallels that you see between 1968? I mean, the fact that the convention was in Chicago, the Democratic National Convention's going to be in Chicago, it's extraordinary, really, to think about some of the parallels.
I think that's right. And I was alive in 1968 as a child, but I can tell you, at least having lived through it as a child, that was a year that doesn't even compare to 2024. Because yes, there were horrible assassinations. Yes, there was tumult, 550,000 Americans in Vietnam, deep anger, riots in the streets in Chicago and elsewhere. But never during that year was the fate of our democracy in any way in question. Joe Biden, for the last 4 years, has said, I ran for president to save democracy and to try to protect it. And he might well say tonight that he stepped out to give a chance to protect democracy to someone better equipped to do it than he is at this moment.
And in some ways, this is really the first draft of his legacy as he wants to see it written.
Absolutely. And I think it's not too much to say, I mean, you know enough about political history and you've seen politics so much close up, Kristen. News alert, politicians do not like to give up power if they do not have to. There are a lot of people who could have been president of the United States this month who would have said, I've got the nomination, I've got it locked up, and you can't take it away from me. Joe Biden gave up power and did it for his country.
Michael Beschloss, we always appreciate your perspective, especially on the big days like this one. Thank you so much. Great to see you.
Thank you, Kristen. Be well.
You too. We are back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now. The news continues with Hallie Jackson right now.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.